Good morning, everyone. I know we're all sort of popping through now, but welcome to Zepto's first Zepto Connect webinar series for the year. I can't believe it's already the 1st of Feb. It's probably no longer appropriate to say Happy New Year now that we're into Feb, but very excited to be here today and be a part of the first session. I'm actually working out of our Sydney office, so just before we kick off, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land where I am today. But it's very exciting for me to announce, and we're kicking off our series for 2024 with a predictions-focused session with some of the best minds in the business from the payment ecosystem. So that is going to be very exciting. But first up, just a couple of things in terms of housekeeping. For those of you who are new to Zepto Connect, I think we had over 100 registrants for this morning. You will see, and from experience, the best webinars we've done are the ones where there is an element of interaction from the audience, and we encourage that. There's a chat box in your screen. You'll be able to see at the top right of your screen. Feel free to comment throughout the session. Below that, there's a Q&A icon where you can post questions you'd like me to ask the panel. There is, ways that you can vote on each question to push some of the ones up the ladder and down. So, please start populating and engaging on there as we kick off. But let's get into it. I think I'd love to just start by introducing the talent. Obviously, I'm Chris Jewell, the CEO of Zepto, but we've got an incredible panel here today. So let's just work our way through it. I'd love for you to meet Andy White, the CEO of AusPayNet. Andy has more than 25 years of international experience in payments and has been in leadership positions at AusPayNet now for more than 8 years. Zepto is a proud member of the AusPayNet community. I think there are 150 members and participants now. We get to witness firsthand the important role AusPayNet plays in championing the payments industry. So welcome, Andy, and thank you for joining. Next, we have Katrina Stuart, General Manager Business Payments at Australian Payments Plus. Katrina, in her leadership role, has been critical in driving the development and adoption of the new payments platform over the last few years. She's been responsible for working with financial institutions, fintechs, and a much broader group of parties to grow volumes and services on the MPP and developing the MPP's platform capability roadmap. So as a connected institution for PayTo, Zepto's been very involved with Katrina and her team, primarily on PayTo, as we've looked to ramp and evolve that product. So welcome, Katrina. And last but certainly not least, we have Keerthi Iyengar, who is an associate partner at McKinsey Company. Keerthi leads McKinsey's technology work in the financial services and telecommunications sectors in Australia. He works with financial technology and payment leaders around the world on scaling transformations that enable the next generation of architecture. So I actually had the pleasure of joining Keerthi on a panel last year that you hosted at South by Southwest, focusing on Australia's position to lead the world when it comes to fintechs and payments. So that was great. So Keerthi, welcome and thank you for joining. I thought I would start with these webinar sessions, just a bit of an icebreaker before we really get into it. Those who know me, I've had a farm. I've been very on the farm, do a lot of work, but I listen to a lot of podcasts. So I take in a lot of information on trends, ideas, opportunities. So I just thought I'd go around and sort of see from the panel any sort of recommendations in the podcast sort of world. I will start and sort of share that my go-to podcast at the moment is a podcast called Acquired, ACQUIRED, Acquired. It is not for the faint-hearted. These are episodes that go for 3 to 5 hours sometimes, and they go deep into some of the leading companies in the world, understanding their business model, how they position, very deep on the trends that they're influencing, from NVIDIA to Nike. But incredible podcast, and I can't recommend it more highly enough. So I don't know, Andy, any thoughts from your end?
Well, I thought I'd broaden it out a bit, actually, Chris. I mean, I don't have a single recommendation. I think my advice is always just kind of go as broad as you possibly can, and just go to multiple sources. I guess what I find fascinating is understanding payments in different contexts, in different jurisdictions, and really sort of seeing where you can learn from that and apply it here in Australia. So I think as broad as you can possibly go, and don't be scared of stuff that seems very US centric or very Asia centric or whatever it might be. You can always take a learning, I think, and apply it back here, and not just on payments but also the wider digital economy. I think, to your point there.
Yeah, go down the rabbit hole for sure. Katrina, any podcast recommendations?
I love good podcasts, Chris. But and I like anything that talks about the MPP, but then I'm a little bit biased, so I just generally follow any commentary in relation to that, whether that's a podcast or an article, etc. I mean, I do like payments.com as a kind of source of information. Similar to what Andy mentioned, I mean, we really like to spend time looking at what's happening around the world as well in the real-time payment space, and talking to some of our kind of, similar operators in other markets, and looking at what's happening in India and the UK and Europe and other markets as well. But if I am listening to a podcast, then probably the payments podcast would be kind of top of my list.
Good. Yeah, I mean, I'm a bit obsessed with the US payment ecosystem as well at the moment. So there's some really good ones there. I think there's one called Off the Rails, which goes deep into ACH, FedNow, TCH. There's a lot, as you said, both said, there's a lot of synergies there. And Keerthi, what about you?
Yeah, I don't really listen to podcasts enough, but I do have sort of my Google Feeds newsletter that I've sort of built off, various sort of different websites over the years. But actually, interestingly, to the question of where do I look to for payment trends, I travel to different countries a lot, and I found there's nothing that's more interesting than just talking to merchants about, what they are seeing, why they chose certain products. I had the funniest story. I went to Vietnam a couple of months ago, and I was talking to a cafe owner, and I said, like, why did you choose this bank or this app for your service? And they said, well, it's got this logo of this lion, and it brings good luck and prosperity, so that's why I chose it. So some really interesting things that you hear that's very left field. So merchants is my source of payment trends.
Well, yeah, look, I agree with all of that. I think getting into the topic, we'll stick with that, with what you just said. Like, McKinsey has access to some incredible enterprise customers across the world. You would have seen last year some trends into 2023 that probably were influencing a lot of those discussions, and we sort of close out the year. Like, what is front and center in terms of what is shaping, discussions right now as we start the year?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So, I mean, look, even though it sometimes feels like we're really far away from the rest of the world when it comes to payments, I think Australia still gets very much looked at as leading the big discussion topics and issues. And I think just the recent ruling last year around digital wallets with Apple and Google, with the Reserve Bank jurisdiction and all of that, that continues to get a lot of attention in the world, and people will be watching that space closely, right? But I think in terms of your more macro question of what is happening around the world, last year was a pretty good year to be in payments. I think our projections of just payment revenues into 2027, we still see it's on track to. We just upped it from $3 trillion in 2027 to 3.1 trillion in 2027. So it's still on track towards that. But what's really interesting is that the mix of where that revenue comes from seems to be shifting quite a lot. And it's moving into sort of some of the more less penetrated areas of the value chain. So especially things like low value cross-border payments, business payments, and areas that may have been under-penetrated in the past. My own perspective, and I think my view as to what I think this means for 2024. I don't know if 2024 is necessarily going to be the year, but I really feel like we're at the cusp of sort of this new era in payments. I think we've kind of had the plastic sort of era where it was all cards and new sources of revenue. Now we've kind of moved into this accounts era, which is, instant transfers has been huge, is leading the era, account to account payments, digital payments. and like, this has kind of created wallet providers and stuff. But I think we're about to move into the next era. I think is going to be more a decoupled era where, the fundamental premise isn't going to be about an account. It's going to be, much more decoupled, embedded into systems, embedded finance. And I think, there's going to be an inflection point. I think it could be 2024, but I think everyone's watching to see sort of what happens.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there, right? Like I always say, and I think for our team, our awareness of what's possible when we think about this new world we're going into is still to a degree anchored to what we know the limitations are today. And, we do need to sort of open our mind. And I think for a lot of people on this call today, we're not convincing them of what modern alternative or payment alternatives provide to a customer experience, which ultimately is the most valuable piece of the pie here. But it is like trying to absorb and consume so much change, and how do you embed that into a process now to move forward. I mean, Andy, switching to you, one of my favorite in Australia, one of the big conferences every year is obviously December and the AusPayNet Summit. Last year was no exception. Quality of people that attend that, presented that, are just off the charts. One of the big topics was obviously for a lot of us here locally is around the decommissioning of BECS into 2030 and what payment alternatives are available. I think one of the questions you just wanted to ask you was like, how important and what were the initial reactions from the membership group around that announcement, and how important is it for us to anchor to an idea that beyond 2030 we need to start to prepare for what that looks like, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thanks for your kind words around the summit. We certainly really enjoyed as an end to the year, as I think people tend to as well. On BECS specifically, the sort of announcement that we made at the summit around the 2030 date was the culmination of 3 rounds of pretty detailed consultation that we did with industry and users. And I think in that consultation, as with any consultation, you hear a variety of views, right? But I think the consistent message that we got was putting a line in the sand around a date would be really helpful. It's really helpful for those that sort of see that move as being necessary. And my reflection on this has always been that, again, thinking about other countries and the way that they face into these things. Most countries are brilliant at setting up new payment rails. They're pretty poor at decommissioning old payment rails. And so we're trying to show a bit of leadership in putting that line in the sand. So helpful for those that are sort of like-minded. Also helpful for starting the conversation with big enterprise customers and with government, because it sort of sets a date, and then you can start those discussions, and particularly have those discussions around the use cases that are currently serviced by BECS and how they could be serviced by alternatives moving forward. So I think that's really useful. And I think when we think about the use cases, one of the consistent messages we got is that the problem here is going to be the bulk payments, right? That those are going to be the trickiest to move because they're pretty embedded in the life cycle of the payment in terms of a straight-through process from enterprise or government into BECS and out. So I think useful in starting that conversation around bulk payments. And I think one of the things to look out for this year is, as part of the strategic plan that Treasury published last year, they announced they'd do a consultation on bulk payments this year. And so that'll be a real focus. And I think that'll really start to flesh out those discussions around those use cases on bulk.
Yeah. And for me, that I'm a massive fan of the direct entry system. It has enabled incredible value for this economy. And equally, I think it's just taking a moment to recognize we are, as an ecosystem here in Australia, doing something that's pretty complex. Like, I can't ever imagine the US trying to have a conversation around decommissioning ACH. Like, this is a big thing that we're going into here with an ambition to create value for our economy, for merchants, for consumers, with what is next. And I think we all are buying into the value we can create. We've just got to do it now in a way that is secure, does bring a reliability and a scalability to replace something that is incredibly valuable and still is to this day incredibly valuable within our economy. So Yeah, I personally, I always think it's probably less about the explicit date of 2030 and more about, as you just said, it's a line in the sand that we know there will be a world beyond this coming, and how do we start to plan and transition.
Yeah, I think Chris, that's spot on. I think the discussion around those use cases has to be around the value that more modern digital alternatives can add to those use cases, right? And so putting that line in the sand, I think, starts creating that conversation around value. By the way, there's talking of sources to read, there's an excellent post by Simone Joyce on LinkedIn around comparing the US and Australia. Exactly your point. US would never close down ACH, but here's why Australia should close down BECS, and it is all of the stuff that, again, we know through the consultation around 24/7 365 availability, rich data, the value that can create. And the potential to build things like confirmation of payee, like payment initiation on more modern alternatives that you can't do on BECS. Right?
Yes. And like just in terms of this prediction lens, we are like collectively in this ecosystem redefining a lot of what is possible, like as a community here. And I know firsthand the world is watching, like, which is incredible, but like we have to manage sometimes our own expectations on how quickly, how fast, and what can transpire, which I think is a really big part of even managing a technology company, of like those expectations can get ahead of what practically we can accomplish, which perfectly switches across to you, Katrina. Like, we have worked together for a long time around MPP. We're both incredibly passionate about, in particular, PayTo as potentially one of those modern payment alternatives that can step up. What are you thinking in particular? Like, there's a lot of expectation around PayTo into last year and into this year. I mean, what can you sort of give us an update on where you think we finished last year, and equally what we're thinking about as we head into 2024?
Yeah, I mean, certainly just to kind of take a step back, I mean, PayTo really is kind of foundational capability that I think is going to open up so many opportunities. And not only will it play a really important role in terms of how as an industry we can look to migrate, payments from BECS over to the MPP, but a better, more modern alternative for direct debit, but also helping to support the migration of credit payments as well. But I think coming back to some of the earlier comments, it really, by enabling that payment initiation, is opening up opportunities for where that can occur and the role that others can play in the ecosystem in terms of being part of that payments journey as well. So we kind of really see it as being really transformational for the market. It is a multi-year journey. These things don't happen overnight. As you know, Chris, the PayTo journey started a number of years ago. I think where we ended 2023, though, was really exciting, because we did end up with having about 90% of retail banking transaction accounts enabled in the Australian market. And, I think that's quite kind of astounding in terms of we've now got that critical mass, and now it's about focusing on how do we help support the industry and organisations, merchants, billers, whoever they might be, to use that service to initiate payments from customers' account, but also looking to do that in a better way as well, in terms of really leveraging the benefits of PayTo in that, it has the customer authorization in the banking channel, so it's a safer alternative as well. There's the benefits of the real-time payments in terms of knowing immediately the outcome of a payment. You don't need to wait 2 days to know, whether or not that payment has been successful, and the value of that real-time data that can be associated as well. So I'm really quietly optimistic about what 2024 is going to bring. I think in terms of the PayTo journey, it is a journey that, does take time to roll out a whole new payment service into the marketplace. But from what we hear from the market, there's a lot of interest around using that service for a range of different use cases. We're already starting to see application in the market, in the travel segment, for example, particularly with the demise of Poly last year. E-commerce, we've seen, application in the securities industry, as you know, because you've been heavily involved also in segments like superannuation. So I think it's really exciting in terms of what the future will bring. I think we're kind of at a point where we've got that sort of critical mass and that network effect in place now, and it's now really going to be about what activity we see on the initiation side. And I think, certainly, obviously, the opportunity around starting to work with the industry around the migration of BECS payments as well. And I just want to touch on a couple of comments that were made earlier. I mean, the MPP, and particularly now with PayTo in place, has the capability to support all of the use cases that we see on BECS today. We're working very closely with the industry and with the banks around how are we going to collectively migrate those payments across, and what does that entail? And I think that's really about some of the operational processes that we need to kind of look at and work on. When we look at kind of bulk payments, I think there's yes, there's very large files that need to be thought about. How are we going to process those on the MPP? And there's ways to do that more efficiently as well, with things like kind of batch booking, how you can kind of build that together on the MPP. But actually, a lot of the files that we see are actually quite small numbers of payments. They're kind of less than 10 payments in a file. And there's a real opportunity, I think, for organisations and corporates to start to think about what that transition journey is for them, and how they start to think about utilising some of the benefits of the MPP, and how that kind of sequencing might happen as well. Because again, it's not something that's going to happen overnight. It will take time. But I think, once we start to see some activity, some of those payments will start to come across quite quickly.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think in pulling that part just for a sec a little bit more, I think the complexity of the transition, like in particular for transformation around technology and embedding it, because like talking about BECS, it's been so embedded in a lot of the ecosystem, like deeply embedded. And then around it, you've got layers of, call it efficiency pieces that have supported BECS. It's very hard to even get your head around as a large, like I'm just pulling out government department or agency, trying to, transition this across. And so I think you're right, like that will happen. And, whether it's McKinsey or a number of other organizations that will be deeply embedded in that transformation process with some of these large organizations, that becomes incredibly difficult. And I think over the next 12 months, that discussion will start to come up as well. How do we, okay, so that makes sense. One of the questions that we've got up here in the thing is, can you share anything around, the volumes of where we're at with PayTo in the ecosystem yet? Is that public? Is that out there? Is that, and I think, I personally, I don't want to get too caught up on the volume. One of the things that, I love to see is that, the engagement now, obviously CBA's done great. ANZ's now out in the market with their capability. The other banks are emerging as well. And that, again, as an ecosystem that is supporting this transition, we all win together. And I think that's another big thing that emerged at the end of last year is, the speed at which more and more people are coming to market to be able to offer this capability is really exciting as well. But just going back to the volumes, anything you can share around that specific to PayTo so far?
Yeah, I mean, we don't publish them at the moment. I mean, we know that it is being looked as a data set that potentially in the future, might be kind of sort of published more broadly. I mean, it is still kind of in the early days in terms of scaling up. And for us, it's really about ensuring that we are working with the industry very closely to resolve any kind of, initial issues. There's still a bit of service variability that we need to work through. But we are certainly seeing, very strong month-on-month growth in terms of the ramp up of those volumes. And as we continue to see more adoption on the payment initiation side, I think that's really going to accelerate as well. So I think kind of 2024 is going to see us kind of reach a bit of a tipping point, and then sort of broader market adoption starting to grow. And we're seeing that as well in terms of some of the kind of different use cases that are coming to market as well. And some of the activity that we see there.
And I would just say from the Zepto side, as we're bringing it to market as well, it's been very exciting. The number of repeat transactions and users once a mandate's created, like the expectation of some merchants who have brought, in terms of the volume that they expected versus what actually happened, it's been very positive. I think one of the key things that we're constantly surprised on is emergence of use cases. And I think the world's, shouting out, like, especially when we go back to a global ecosystem, we've seen a lot of move around real-time payments for early adopters, right? And they're very well flagged and publicized. But the biggest challenge now and that the world is looking for is the application of real-time payments now into more mainstream enterprise use cases and flows. And that has been surprising to us. I know we've got a bit later on that we wanted to talk about use cases, but I was just going to shout one out now. Like a company that we met, who's actually another portfolio company of Airtree, and I think they presented at one of the AP Plus conferences last year, was Fetch Pet Insurance. So we think about insurance as being premiums in and claims out, and that's a very binary way for us to be thinking about flow. But this is what blew my mind, is that you're bringing in now, they're looking at it less about those two endpoints, but embedded in the flow internally is, okay, a emergency surgery on your dog, where we can use PayTo to create a mandate to pay excess and then ship the money to the vet in real time to create, that certainty and consistencies there. And I think they're the sort of things that start to create excitement, where we're breaking down this new sense of what's possible when it comes to actually more flows around payment journeys and things that, again, have been absent because the capability as we go into this on-demand digital world has just not been there. So I think what we're hoping to see, and we will see, is more of those types of use cases which start to expand for everyone the application of not just the MPP, but other payment capabilities that give a greater experience to merchants and their customers. So that's exciting.
And I think it is. I think it is really about the opportunity to actually reinvent some of those kind of payment journeys and those customer experiences and the value that can generate as well. I think for us is what's really exciting about PayTo, and it's about kind of being an alternative payment option, but I think it's actually much more about and broader around actually what that can mean and the benefits that can unlock for a whole range of different organisations, because it supports not just kind of scheduled recurring payments, but it's one-off payments, it's ad hoc payments, similar to how I might use my card on file, for example, and that just opens up a whole world of opportunities.
Yeah, I think going back to what we said before, just in terms of managing expectations on what we can reasonably achieve over the next 12 months. Against the backdrop of so many things emerging at the moment. Like, not only do we have technology and innovation being front and center, and for us it's on real-time payments, but we've got AI, we've still got blockchain, we've still got developments around potential open banking, we've got the emergence of like fraud and scam. And I think one of the things that we bring it back to still is around trust in the ecosystem, and this is regardless of the payment channel, but trust becomes really, really important. And I know, Andy, AusPayNet, one part of the value that I see as a member is just your engagement with government from a regulatory perspective, and a way of approach and working at the moment has touched on National Anti-Scam Centre and fighting fraud and scam. I think I'm really interested in your thoughts in terms of payment reforms and regulation in the next 12 months, in particular when it comes to fraud and scam, which I see as being incredibly important for us all, not just in payments, but as an ecosystem to think about. I'm really keen for your thoughts around that and what we can expect into 2024.
Yeah, it's a great question, Chris. I think let me start with scams. I often talk about scams as a generational obligation that we all have to solve, and I do mean all of us. I think what's been interesting, again, sort of thinking globally, is the way that Australia's faced into scams. I think is probably the most sophisticated way of thinking about it that you're seeing globally, and it's now being pointed to. We're now being pointed to as a country that's sort of leading the way. We've still got a way to go in terms of implementation, but the reason I say that is because the thinking behind the National Anti-Scam Centre was, it should do what it says on the tin. It should be a national thing, and therefore it needs to involve the whole scams life cycle. And so therefore, I'm lucky enough to be on their advisory board, but as well as sort of payments and banking, you've also got digital communication platforms, you've got telcos, you've got the consumer representative, you've got the merchant representative. So I think you've got that whole of scam life cycle piece. And you're now starting to see that in one of the consultations that has just finished earlier this week on the National Anti-Scam Codes. Again, the idea there is that those codes would apply to digital communication platforms and telecommunication providers, as well as financial institutions. That's very different, for example, from the UK, where the UK is focused solely on financial institutions and kind of reimbursement. And we think that's important, and the National Anti-Scam Centre thinks that's important, because if you do it the way that Australia's going to do it, you've got a chance of stopping some of the scams at source. So where the consumer is being socially engineered on the digital communication platform, or through an SMS or through an email, you can stop it there rather than waiting until it becomes a payment problem. And that's particularly important when you think about scams like investment scams is the obvious example. It's about half of the scams that we saw in Australia last year. The value was staggering, $1.5 billion. That's just the economic value, and then you think about the damage that's actually done emotionally to the person on the receiving end of that. I mean, those investment scams, by the time you're getting to the payment, the person is paying who they want to pay. They're convinced that they're doing the right thing. It's about stopping it way earlier in the life cycle. So a win would be that those national anti-scam codes actually come into legislation this year. That would be a win for government in that respect. Just to touch more broadly on payments reform, those that are in the policy space won't have had much of a break over Christmas and New Year, because as well as the scams consultation, you also had one on checks, and crucially you had one on payments licensing, so the second one on payments licensing. Again, we see that licensing piece is really critical, because effectively it's levelling the playing field, and by levelling the playing field and licensing those entities who currently aren't licensing, of course you're protecting customers and consumers, and that comes back to the scams point, but you're also enabling innovation. We've seen those kind of license regimes elsewhere, the e-money licenses in UK, Europe, Singapore. They've really incentivised innovation and given credibility to innovators. So we think that's really important, and again, a win would be for that piece to get into legislation this year. And I think the other opportunity for government in this space is to show real leadership in moving their payments out of checks, out of BECS, into more modern digital alternatives.
Yeah, well, on both those points, I think that the fraud and scam piece with the ecosystem approach, I think, is really important, right? But there are times where even we're frustrated that we feel some of those discussions could happen faster. Do you mean because we've talked about social media, telcos, and payments, and I think we've spent a lot of time with most of you on the call here around the payment end of it. But I think the faster we as an ecosystem can bring ourselves together to fight it. I think I even think about my mum, who's 82. Like, she's sort of got to the point now where she doesn't trust anyone. Like, she doesn't want to take a phone call. She doesn't want to make a payment, and it's like really hard to see someone who's so independent start to really struggle with how they navigate this digital world we're going into. And I think all of us have a commitment here to fight the good fight, put pressure on the bad actors. So, but it does feel that some of these discussions need to happen faster. So I think that's a big thing going into 2024, that we all resource and allocate. This is not something that we want to put in for a quarter and then slow down. This is a perpetual, desire now to push forward. And I think, the licensing thing is super important as well. Zepto, as you know, we've become connected to the MPP. We love the idea of going deeper with the right licensing. And I think for everyone, licensing brings a level of governance and trust and capability to know that there is, framework that sits behind the license that we adhere to. And ultimately, that innovation is great because it drives efficiency around payment capability, but it drives competition for payment services. And if we can do that in a way that is a license that provides, innovation, not at the expense of risk, but in a way that's, governance first, everyone wins here. So I think they're two really, really cool things. Hey, Keerthi, just on that, like when you think about what you're saying, you said at the very start, merchants and merchants now thinking about these different ways to pay. But when it comes to cyber fraud, scam, anything that you can share around how consumers are choosing to pay, and any sort of trends that you're seeing there, like that touch on that awareness?
Yeah, so I mean, we haven't seen a huge shift in trends of consumers, how consumers are trying to pay specifically as a result of cyber scam fraud. Like, we've seen in Asia in particular, there's been like almost like triple the growth of like e-commerce and digital payments, instant payments. So there's a huge amount of growth there. I think, but the looking forward aspect, I think, I mean, it's really interesting hearing from Andy and Katrina, like Andy and yourself, Chris, just around this topic, because there's so much of conversation happening, and there is so much of like discussion around what the problem space is, what the solution space like could be, and what different actors need to do in that. But I don't think that sophistication of conversation necessarily extends like across the industry, like beyond the people that really operate in the space. And I think that needs to shift quite a lot, because I think the question of will consumers shift how they pay is really dependent on whether companies fail to manage this, because there's no question that the sophistication is like exponentially growing. One interesting one interesting conversation that tends to repeatedly happen with the banks I work with is, like for universal banks, especially in Asia, pretty much about 30 to 40% of their overall tech and ops spend is associated with payments, like across the payments like lifecycle, right? So it's a huge percentage of the cost base. And then when you also query the payments leaders, the CIOs and the COOs about, what they think that's going to look like in the future, they're seeing sort of that they need to create 30% additional headroom in terms of how much they need to continue to invest and spend. That headroom is either going to come from creating efficiencies, driving more automation, doing things cheaper, faster, reducing the cost of their legacy and technology, or it's going to have to come from more investment, right? So I think there's no question that in order to continue to play in this space, that there is just going to need to be this continued investment to sort of combat the increasing sophistication of cyber fraud, scam, and just consumer and regulator expectations as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I try and think about what is influencing that. Like, I think wallets, like obviously stored value in wallets, digital wallets become really important. And, but we can't have like 50 wallets in our phone, do you know what I mean, that have different things. And so, and I know, Katrina, when it comes to AP Plus, you've got, identity, and the idea of digital wallet is something that's on the roadmap that sort of helps try and drive to deal with the complexity for a consumer and merchants that are trying to overcome that. I mean, anything you can share from the MPP or the AP Plus's point of view?
Yeah, I mean, coming back to the question of trust, I mean, I think it's always a delicate balance between, customers wanting convenience and sort of simplicity in that payments journey versus how do you actually provide trust and assurance as well, and the safety for them and protect them against things like scams. And so for us, I think really focus on the role that we can play in helping to build that trust in the AP Plus products and services that we provide to the Australian market. And how do we really help build that assurance that when I'm making a payment or receiving a payment, I know who's at the other end of that. And so there's a few things that we're working on that's going to be quite fundamental to that. So obviously our digital identity solution, Connect ID, that went live last year, will play, I think, a really important role as more things move into the digital world. And we're really looking at how do you bring that together with the payments journey as well, and how we can kind of bring those two together. The other is confirmation of payee as well, and really working with the industry that, whether I'm paying either by Pay ID or BSB or account number, that I will actually get to know who I'm paying before I make that payment, and providing that assurance as well. And I think that there's some of the kind of foundational capabilities that are going to be really important in helping to build continued trust in the products and services that we have in the Australian market. But it's a really key area of focus for us. And we're also looking at what else can we do together with industry. So things like with the data that we get on the MPP, can we utilise that more? Can we help the banks to be able to incorporate that into some of their fraud mitigation strategies and monitoring tools as well? And what else can we do collectively as an industry? Because I think it's going to be about working together to really tackle some of these issues. And that's why some of the work that Andy referenced as well, I think, is just so critically important. It's multi-sector, multi-industry. It's collaboration of everybody doing what's best for Australia.
Yeah, and which is great, and I've been able to see some of those things evolve firsthand, which is great. And I think, behind the scenes as well, there's an education process for everyone to try and absorb the rate of change to fight, and enhance trust. We were just thinking, like, we're never going to be at Zepto like a UX UI. We're never facing a consumer direct to change the customer payment experience. We're providing access to the technology into the infrastructure. That's the way we see it. But like, I was just thinking the other day, just even like in a wallet overlaying like at eBay where you get the score, like this wallet's done, 100,000 transactions and they've all been successful. There's been no dispute. Like, how there are some potentially even some low hanging fruit pieces that we can embed into that gives another layer of certainty just at a very familiar level as well. And there will always be, unfortunately, a level of sophistication around crime, financial crime, fraud and scam that is out attacking it. But again, I think taking away from today that, like, it seems in all four of our organizations, this piece of trust and the attention given to fraud, scam and financial crime is, top of the ladder in terms of, a big focus point for our organizations, which is great. I'm actually just looking through some of the questions here that we've had. And I think one of them, this last one, just around, at the AusPayNet Summit, the Reserve Bank Governor did call out very clearly about the, improving the reliability of the MPP. She put up that diagram that showed, how often it was down versus other alternatives. I think that's going to be obviously a key focus in this transition to a post-2030 world. Like, what are our thoughts here? And probably Katrina, sort of looking at you first. Anything you want to share?
Thanks, Chris. Reliability has been a focus for us with the MPP for a while, and that's why we have certain requirements on our participating banks in terms of their availability and their uptime, which basically equates to being up all of the time, 24/7, except for 2 minutes a month. And that's a pretty high standard, I think, to have. And we actually introduced a number of years ago that as a mandatory compliance requirement as well. So there are non-compliance charges that will apply if people don't meet that. It has been a continued journey. I mean, obviously, when the platform went live, it was a new platform. There was kind of teething problems. We're still working through some of that with our participating banks. A number of the organisations have multi-year programs of work around what they need to do in their environments and their back offices to uplift the capability as well and focus on resilience. I mean, I would know that obviously, sometimes the platform goes down, but the recovery time that we see on average is relatively short as well. So typically it's up and running again within a kind of short window of, say, 30 minutes or less. What we have also kind of built into the MPP design is to make it highly resilient by nature as well. So the fact that it is a distributed architecture of different payment gateways that talk to each other means that if one individual bank goes down, the others can continue to operate as well. And I think that has, been kind of one of the successful design elements of the MPP. But, needless to say, obviously, there's further work that needs to be done. It is one of our kind of key areas of focus as we think about BECS migration and volumes continue to ramp up on the MPP and how we work with the banks on that. I mean, certainly the RBA is obviously focusing on just the general issue of resilience on payment systems. And, they introduced their reporting as well. I think it was last year. To kind of, focus a bit of a light on that as well in terms of, what individual banks are doing and their kind of performance in that space. And so we'll continue to work with industry and the RBA on that area as well.
Yeah. We're sort of running out of time here, but I would add to that, like, what I love about this is it's escalating the focus for what we need today. Like, we know that there's work to be done and we're all working hard around that. So I think it is important, though, that we continue to sort of reference the progress and hold that front and centre for a safe transition to a world that we know we're heading into. Just before we do wrap up, and there was heaps of other things we could have talked about. We didn't really get into transparency of pricing and a few other things that are out there. But one, I just wanted to try out, are there any use cases that you can see emerging that would get you excited? I mean, I mentioned the one around the insurance that just starting to break down the barriers of what we think is possible. But just going around the grounds here, is there anything that sort of stands out to anyone in terms of use cases or applications that might surprise us all heading into this year? Keerthi, start with you.
Just continue being surprised, Chris.
Sorry,
I would definitely answer this with I think we're going to see some really interesting use cases like that is within an industry vertical, and within this, you don't have to break out for that payments. The frictionless is going to go into a completely different level, and all the intermediaries and collections and I think we're going to, I would, if you ask me to put a bet, I'm going to put a bet on education and healthcare as two industries. We're going to see some pretty interesting things.
Love it. Education, healthcare. Katrina?
I just continue to be surprised by the use cases that we do see. I mean, I think areas like securities will actually surprise us in terms of, you might not think that that's a space where you might see payments innovation, but, we've already seen some of that happen with, things like the bonds exchange and what's been happening there, using the MPP for being able to invest in bonds. You can basically invest into gold using PayTo at the moment as well, which I think is exciting, and basically be able to do cardless withdrawals at the ATM as well. So I think it's just going to permeate into so many different sectors. But I think in particular areas like B2B payments is really ripe for innovation, and I think we'll see some really interesting things come out of that area.
Perfect. And Andy, any last words from you around
I'll finish. I mentioned it earlier. I'll finish with government. I mean, government payments are such a large factor in the Australian economy, and government's still the biggest user of checks, right? If we're serious about ending checks, then that needs to change, and obviously a big user of BECS. And I just think the potential benefits to productivity in the economy, if government can truly digitise those payments, make them real time, is exceptional. So, I think it's an important one.
Absolutely. Well, hey, look, I know we've gone a little bit over here, but I really appreciate everyone's time today, and for everyone who dialed in, hopefully some of the insights as to what we're seeing on the horizon have been helpful. But please reach out. Thanks, everyone, and I'll speak to you all soon.